start introducing myself while the computer's being set up. I'm Kelly Yarian, and I am a lecturer in the Linguistics department, and I also am the director of the master's program in language teaching specialization, which is part of linguistics. And as why I think I'm here helping with this part of the workshop, which is going to be focused on writing specifically, it just dovetails perfectly. You guys organized this well. Dovetails very perfectly with what Katie was talking to you about. Is in our master's program, I see every single student's master's project go over my desk and work a lot with them on writing. And it's the master's projects are very similar to theses, only it's a more applied aspect at the end, product at the end. I also teach, I have taught many writing classes, including ones for international graduate students, and started the one that we have now here in the university for international graduate students, and have taught it before in other positions that I've had. So it's a topic that I'm very interested in. Usually when I'm actually working with students in my classes or in the program, I'm working on the sort of end product when they already have a draft, and I'm working on what are some ways to write, some techniques for writing. That's not always, though, maybe the most important part of the process. So I'm actually going to ask you to now take about 1 minute to look at the first part of your handout. There's this first part, one, what's challenging for you? And then the second part there, what are your writing process assumptions? You just take a moment to check off those areas. Is something very challenging or not very challenging, or somewhere in between for you? This is a way for me to get to know a little bit about you, like Katie did with asking about your backgrounds, which now I don't have to ask that. It's good.
Do we have any more of those handouts? I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah, they're right up here. Anybody else need one? Okay. So the other ones I got two for. All right, let me just see a show of hands here. It gives me a sense of where you are all at with thinking about your writing process. How many of you wrote as very challenging or somewhat challenging finding and developing my ideas? Would you raise your hand? Okay. And raise your hand if that's the problem that you're having now. That's usually something more at the beginning. Now you're doing your new lit search, right? Getting started on your writing. How many people have had some challenges with that? Okay, all right. Organizing my ideas. Okay, and those were some great tools for organizing. Writing clearly and elegantly as appropriate in your discipline. Okay, great. Citing sources. Okay. Editing, grammar, spelling, etc. All right. Okay, well good, I guessed correctly in that the areas that are most challenging are the ones that I'm going to try to hit on a little bit today. And when I said that what I do in my classes is not always what's most key, that's related to the idea of getting started on your writing. I'm usually not talking about that so much in the class. But I think it's such an important part of, and keeping going, such an important part of writing that I wanted to have some of this today be about that. Because there's so many topics in writing that, of course, we can't cover all of them. Then, so I want to do that. Some common bits of wisdom about getting started and keeping going. Then related to that are metaphors for the writing process. And then a little bit about organization. Just one thing that I think is very helpful is thinking about your introductions, because they are an important aspect for self-positioning, your positioning in your discipline and what you're contributing. And then one quick style point. There's so many great style points. This is one that I think is kind of fun and useful. And then finally, trying it out. And these things will become a little bit clearer as we go. I want to see, though, your answers to number 2. I'm not going to comment too much on the answers because that will come out in what we're talking about today, but just to see what you're thinking. When is the best time to start writing about your research ideas? When you've read enough of the literature that you found through using Katie Len's tips about how it fits into current work? How many of you raise your hand? Okay. When all your data has been collected and analyzed. Okay. Today's a good time. All right. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Who is the audience of your initial drafting process? So your initial drafting process, your advisor? Okay. Readers of your eventual articles or books? Okay. You. Okay. All right, nice spread here. Under what conditions should you sit down to write? Any small length of time, but regularity is key. All right. When you're sure you've had a nice long block of time in which to concentrate. That never happens for me, so I can't even look at that one. And then only when everything's done. Okay, that one's kind of a joke. That's never done. All right. And then finally, of these 3 metaphors, which one might be the most apt for the writing process? Connecting a chain of words together. I mean, my words are going linearly through time right now, one connected to the other. We write words across a page too, but nobody's raising their hands. Laying bricks from the foundation up, okay? Or developing a painting layer by layer. Okay, more hands over here. Interesting. All right, so let's move on here, and some of these things will come up, like I said. Drafting stages. So this is where the tips for getting started and keeping going come up. And these are I've culled from different places. They're not my own ideas necessarily, although these are ones that I think resonate with me and with other people I know who are successful writers. Start early and start messy. So write as you read. You can even call this read-a-writing. That's what I like to call it. Don't wait until you're done reading to start writing, because you're never done reading. Katie made that point very clearly. And yes, of course, you're starting your writing in terms of actually crafting a complete text, maybe after you've done the lay of the land on the literature. So that was related to that first question. But really, you can start writing immediately in your first article that you read, or even before you've read anything. You can write down your ideas. In fact, you might feel more naive and free to write when you don't know what you're talking about yet, you know, in terms of what other people have said and whether you're right or wrong. You can start writing right away. And actually writing while you're reading, taking notes on those readings, and having questions come up is great. Now, how to organize that, there might be some good tips for that I won't get into here. But I always write my notes actually on the article itself, kind of old-fashioned way. But then maybe when you're entering notes in EndNote, you can go in and cull out your key points or your key questions, perhaps. So really, this takes more time, but it's so much better than later on going back and saying, what was that about? And then having just a blank article, or having to search for it again, and you have no notes, nothing on the page, and you basically have to reread it. That takes a lot more time down the road. So just like putting in the investment of starting EndNote, you're putting in the investment of writing. And it's amazing when I see these projects coming through. The first chapters are kind of painful, they're not so well written. Boy, when you get to the conclusion, you can write a conclusion in 1 day or 2 days, because by then the fluency is there. You've been writing so much, and under such time pressure, you've gotten good at knowing when to cut your losses and just get something down, and when not to. And actually, it's better written. And that's related to some of what I'm going to say here too. Well, when you're first writing, I'd say let yourself be the first audience. So that's related to one of the questions there. Just think of yourself as the first audience instead of worrying about your advisor looking over your shoulder and reading the lines that you're writing down. And I only say that because, not because of course you need to know your audience, you do, but just because writing is such a way of getting to know what you're writing about, or even knowing how to phrase something. You can find that by doing. So imagine yourself as being in a hole that nobody else can look into when you're writing that stuff, and then you can throw it away or put it into a do not open file for other people if you want. But it shouldn't, intimidation shouldn't be part of this initial process. Write a little every day. This is very, or almost every day. Brainstorming notes, journaling to yourself, just one paragraph, whatever works for you. One paragraph a day equals a lot more than, 50 pages written in the last week or something like that. It really does, because of the process and being able to think about it and connect it to other things as you go. And I do this, it really does work. I'm a very busy person. I have a lot of administrative duties. I have 2 kids. It's quite a life, but I get in my little writing in the beginning of the day, and I don't hold myself to high standards until I'm starting that revision process toward the end. And it works. Practice telling people about your work in plain words, and that's going to relate to something we talk about with style. It can be so convoluted when we're first trying to figure out what we are contributing. And if you can tell it to someone in your family, at least to some degree, that isn't in your field, in a way that makes sense, even if it doesn't sound very important, you've made a big stride. And when you write to yourself, try writing in plain words. Although if you don't, if it's all convoluted, that's fine too, because that's part of the point, is that it can be very messy. Create a writing support group. Does anybody have these yet? Anybody have friends? Oh, good. I had one doing my dissertation. I miss having that now. Hold each other to deadlines and numbers of pages written, even if you don't show them to anybody. That can really help you get going, just to report to people, yes, I did it. And then if you don't, they're your friends, so they won't dump you. And then whatever you write, it will change anyway. That's so important to know is, you get to that point, you finally have this manuscript to give to a committee, and then they tear it apart, or they suggest a whole area of research that you had no idea about, or your second reader does, or some other committee member. And so it's going to change a lot anyway, so just get your stuff down and don't worry about perfection. So those are some tips just for getting going and getting the process started. And that kind of relates to metaphors. So here are pictures of those first 2 metaphors. Nobody raised their hand on this one. Why not? Why is the writing process not like putting a chain together, if that's the end product? Yeah?
I would say that that's only one part of the process. So
Okay.
There's some bigger ideas that are being connected as well.
Okay, great. Other ideas too? Reactions to that?
Well, I think for me, writing is really personal, and the way that I sort of look at my life and kind of putting bricks together, putting pieces together, that's how I also approach my writing, and sort of getting a foundation and then building upon that and getting to more complexity and having sort of the whole be greater than just one brick, right?
Okay, yeah. And this too, the whole could be seen as bigger than one link. But you're saying, kind of building on a foundation, going up. Yeah.
I think the brick has been one of my problems, because I cannot, when I'm stuck in something, I cannot go forward and start writing another thing. I have to finish, so I'm building up. So I think the connecting a chain together would be useful for me.
Okay. So the problem with the brick metaphor is you lay it down, you can't necessarily go back and switch it around.
I'm kind of building like that, so.
Okay. Yeah, so there's pieces of these metaphors that work and pieces that don't. The chain seems very solid and unchanging. That's one problem potentially with that. You break a chain and it feels like a big problem. And each link seems very permanent. And you could even say that with this, that when you lay down a layer of bricks and you get up here, it's hard to go back and change the layer of bricks. They've been laid down. So that's why, even though I think there are nice elements of this to think about with pieces that connect to a whole, I think my favorite kind of metaphor is this idea of a painting. And I think of it as thinking of layers when you're writing, when you're drafting, rather than linear. I'm starting at the beginning, at my introduction, and I do 5 pages a day, and I get to the end and I'm finished. I did actually meet one person who was successful at that kind of writing, but only one. So here, this is just a painting. It's kind of blocked in. Can you see it at all, what it is? It's kind of hard to tell. But this person has blocked it in, which is actually already a big part of the process, that it's sort of blocked in. I'm thinking of this sort of like an outline. When you've outlined something and you've got a pretty solid idea of what it is. Then, as you start filling that in, getting the whole picture, all the pieces together, then you figure out what you're going to be highlighting more and filling in and drawing out for your audience specifically, and finally editing it completely, you know, in all the fine touches. And this is an artist that I've seen, she has a bunch of paintings and she puts all of her process online. That's what I really love. She's got all these paintings of her process. And I like that idea of layers. I think that works pretty well. Although, again, if she needed to change a major thing, like, oh no, that baby's not good, she needs another baby, then that would be, you know, a major thing. But she could lay it on. She could put other paint on top. It's not like the bricks. Okay, so that was just a little bit about, you know, how maybe an approach to thinking about writing, that you're laying layers on, that the first aspect of it doesn't have to look beautiful. Nobody starts in one corner and makes it perfect all the way across to the other corner. I think that's a nice way to think about your writing, and it lets you loosen up and do this part without so much intimidation about it looking like this right from the beginning. That's really important. But to move beyond that then, once you do start having a sense, like maybe here, of what it's looking like, you do have to start really thinking about your audience, and not only what you know, like your example with ADD, what you know, but what your audience needs to know. And that's where we get into kind of starting to organize your ideas for our audience, which might already be happening in your first drafts, but then you need to shape that a little bit more. So my question then for you to ask for some ideas is, what does a reader of academic texts need to know? When you open an article that's been published, or a dissertation, or a master's thesis, what do you want to know from it? I'll just ask you to.
The contribution.
Okay, the contribution. What else then?
The goals, objectives.
Okay. Okay, the goals and objectives of that. What's the purpose of the article?
Methodology.
Okay, methods, how they do that.
How it contributes to the field.
Okay.
So where it fits in the literature.
Okay, where it fits in the literature. Great.
Kind of reading a description, so I know where to find what maybe I'm just interested in.
Okay, kind of an outline or outline of key points.
It's theoretical sort of foundations.
Okay, theoretical foundations. So how it fits into the literature, but also what that literature is, or what assumptions there are that is the lay of the land this is being put into. Okay, great. So many of the things you said are right here, and all of those are true. Often a reader of academic text is looking for what is that background context or literature? What problem are you addressing? So what's the gap, or what you can call a niche in the literature? Or even opportunity. Sometimes it's not so much that there's a problem that's being addressed, but there's something still unknown that you want, it's an opportunity to contribute to. What your focus is, your claim, as you said. And support for your claim also is somewhere in your article. You've got to provide support, both from the literature and then, of course, from your own research. Yeah, convince the reader that your claim is solid. So an example of where much of this can be found, not so much the support, but much of the rest of it can be found, is actually in an introduction. You have to do all that in the introduction. And that's what makes sometimes introductions really hard to write, because it has everything in it, including your conclusions sometimes even, at the end of the introduction. And so introductions are not just written at the beginning. All the more reason to think of it as a layered approach. You might map it out at the beginning, you might get these pieces in place, but you actually usually have to go back and finish it when your research is completed. So I'd like for us to actually look at now this sheet. I don't have it on a slide. Do you need some? Okay. Anybody else need some? Oh, okay. Let's see. Well, there's 3. There's 2. More. Okay. There's 2 more. You can kind of pass back. Okay. Do you need one? Okay. And here's 2 more. I'm going to pass it on back. Okay, so I'm looking at this part here. I actually forgot to bring the books that this comes from, but it is sorted at the cited at the bottom. I wanted to bring it because it's a great book. It's actually for international graduate students. Mostly it has language-related points in it, but it doesn't say for international students on the front because it's actually very applicable to everybody, except for some of those language points in every chapter. If you are an international or a second language speaker of English or writer of English, then the language points are very useful also. But anyway, the citations down here. One thing, this is John Swales and Christine Feek. And they've done a lot of research on looking at academic articles. And they found by doing research on research articles that most of the time, 70 to 80% of the time, introductions follow this kind of format. We're all pretty familiar with the general to specific, areas, the lay of the land down to where you fit into that. But they discovered that, or wrote basically, they discovered that there are basically these 3 moves. Moves meaning like chess moves, rhetorical moves in an introduction. And the first move one being, what are we talking about? What's the literature that we're talking about? What are the topics we're talking about? And then narrowing down to where is an opportunity or problem or gap or niche in this literature that I want to focus my reader on. And then you set up that problem, and then how is my research going to address that problem? And then maybe some other stuff like the outline of the article, or maybe some conclusions, or a little bit about the methods. Those kinds of things can be in move 3 also. But so what has been done, what still needs to be done, and how am I doing part of that job? And it's not in every research article, so you'll find some that are not like this and that are very successful, but the majority really are. And this is not a how-to. This was their empirical research on research articles. So it really is what's being done out there. It's the practice, common practice. And why I think it's nice for you to look at is not only for your own writing, but when you're reading, to be able to recognize this and see whether in your field this seems to be common. So here at the bottom, there's an example that is not from their book. It's from an article in physics, basically. And it shows where this breaks down. And I'd like to just read this aloud, part of it. So this is establishing the field, move 1. The thermal properties of glassy materials at low temperatures are still not completely understood. Now that may seem like a gap, but it's kind of a very large, broad gap. The thermal conductivity has a plateau, which is usually in the range 5 to 10 K, and below this temperature, it has a temperature dependence, which varies approximately as T squared. The specific heat below 4K is much larger than that than would be expected from the Devier theory, and it often has an additional term which is proportional to T. Now, we may have no idea what that means because this is for an audience in this field, but we still get a sense that this is describing some topic, some area, and people in that field would recognize that as that move. What we can recognize is what happens in the next sentence. Some progress has been made toward understanding the thermal behavior by assuming that there is a cutoff of the photon spectrum at high frequencies, blah, 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 and that there is an additional system of low-lying two-level states. Nevertheless, more experimental data are required, and in particular, it would seem desirable to make experiments on glassy samples whose properties can be varied slightly from one to the other. We can recognize that last sentence as being a gap or something that needs to be addressed, a problem. It's pretty clear even to us outside the field. And in fact, they set it up really well. Oh, so we really need this thing. And then indeed, the present investigation reports attempts to do this by blah, 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 blah. So this is a very, very short introduction, but it shows you those three moves pretty clearly. Turn on the back. I actually had a nice one from art history example, but I didn't bring it, unfortunately. But on the back here, see if you can skim this part and see if you can find where move 2 starts, a problem in the area of the field, and then where move 3 starts, which is where your contribution is coming in, the author's contribution. And you can talk to your partner after you confirm with your partner what you find. Sometimes it's easiest to find where move 3 starts and then work a little bit backwards to see what gaps are identified. Okay, where do you see move 3? How does it start?
This paper.
Okay. This paper presents a case study of blah, blah, blah. Right, and often it is at the beginning of a paragraph. It's pretty easy to find when you're skimming, or that's a good strategy for a writer to be able to put that very clearly in there. And believe me, this seems obvious, but when I see a lot of students writing, then their contribution does not start like that or at the beginning of a paragraph. It's sort of buried in the middle, and it's done in a passive voice or something where it's really unclear, oh, this is the contribution. So it seems obvious here because it's so well marked, but in your process of writing, it's not always so clear. It's something that you have to craft deliberately. Where do you see a mention of a gap or a problem?
Line 3.
Which one?
In line 3.
In line 3, okay, although there's a large body of knowledge, okay, so they're showing that there's a gap. And then after that, there's some information about how that's been tried, how people have tried to address some of that. But then there's I think this one is an interesting one actually, because there is no straightforward move 2 that's really as clearly identifiable as this one. It's a little bit of a cyclical kind of move 1, move 2, move 1, move 2. And it's probably because there are different kinds of literatures that are being brought together in this particular example. So if you had a hard time saying, oh, that one is move 2, it's because I think this one is a nice example of how it actually can be cycled in from move 1 to move 2 to move 1 to move 2. But usually move 3 is pretty clear. And right before move 3, you'll see something that does clearly indicate a gap. And here it says, and there is an urgent need to understand them in greater detail. So you see a need being clearly focused on, and then the student's work or the writer's work. Again, this seems kind of obvious when you read it, but when you see I see so many papers where this move 2 is pretty weak. Whether it's in one place or it's distributed a little like this example, it's not clearly argued why do we care? It's the so what question. Why do we care about your contribution? So not just what have people done, what are you doing, but how are they connected? what's the story behind your contribution?
In my field, what the papers are doing is that the literature review is completely separated from introduction. We have an introduction and separate like maybe 5 to 6 pages of literature review.
Yes.
Which is here is literature review is somehow in the introduction, and there is nothing like after that paper doesn't talk about the literature review, right?
Well, possibly. I didn't look carefully at the rest of this article, but you're right that, and especially in dissertations and theses, it's very separated in terms of there's a literature review. But the introduction often does cite sources. Their sources are cited, sometimes the same ones as a kind of overview or citation of key studies, or citation of an area that's important but isn't part necessarily of the literature review, like about the region, for example, but then the literature review is more about theory. So you will see citations in both most of the time. But in a research article, once you start publishing, sometimes there isn't a separate literature review. It is combined into the introduction because nobody wants to read your literature review. As much as they care about the literature, they want to see it condensed. And often it's combined into an introduction. So that's a good question. Yeah, the literature is cited in the literature review too. So that I wanted to just mention that because when you're starting to organize your ideas for an audience, you should think about what is your story that's leading up to your contribution. But don't let that intimidate you while you're getting started. I just want to reiterate that you don't have to know all of this when you're starting to write. A last thing I wanted to mention about style that I think is, there's so many things we could say about style, but I think this one is kind of interesting, to talk about nouns. Are they just person, place, or thing like we might have learned in grade school? Well, often in academic writing, there aren't just nouns, there are what we call nominalizations. And that word is big and scary, and in fact, it's sort of like something that creeps into your writing to make your writing kind of big and scary too, to the reader sometimes. Now, they're not all bad, and I want to talk about this, but nominalizations are when you, as a writer, are turning usually verbs, sometimes adjectives and adverbs, into nouns. And when you turn something into a noun, you make it into a kind of abstract thing, something to be looked at, which is what academics do. So it makes sense. But let's look at these two examples. So I'm going to read these aloud. The first one, and I'll ask you which one is clearer. It's the same basic idea. The Federalists argued that popular democracy destabilized government because they believed that factions tended to further their self-interest at the expense of the common good. Okay. Academic, right? It has, if you don't know what this is about, it's dense. But how about the next one? The Federalists' argument that the destabilization of government was the result of popular democracy was based on their belief in the tendency of factions to further their self-interest at the expense of the common good. There's a difference in those two. Which one is clearer? Okay. First one is, most people say, clear. Now, it can depend. If you're in the field and you're writing about this topic, the second one might feel really, really clear. It's just something to be careful of. I highlighted what happened here. Up here you see verbs. The Federalists, they're the subject. They are doing what? They're arguing about something that is destabilizing something else because they did something else. They believed something. So each noun in there is really an entity that is a noun. And each verb in there is a real action that's happening. Down here, we find that these actions have been nominalized. The Federalists' argument now. So arguing has become an argument. Destabilizing has become the destabilization of. Believed has become a belief. And tended to do something has become the tendency to do something. This is really common in academic writing to use a lot of nominalizations because people think it looks more objective and it looks more knowledgeable. You know, you look like you're a smarter writer, perhaps. You look smarter, often. You know, that's the sense if you ask people what the reactions are to that. But it's harder to read, so you have this trade-off. And what some people have found are that it's the graduate students in the PhD programs that write the most like this. And the established scholars who have gotten tenure, they're writing like that, or even simpler. They're just saying it like it is, and they're not doing all this kind of stuff. So it's not that nominalizations are bad, but if you use too many of them, you're actually getting yourself into a big tangle. And it's not going to be clear like telling your family member what your topic is about. So you had a question.
Is this related to the active and passive voices?
It can be. Notice though that that this, let's see, was based on their belief in the tendency. It's not always related, but it sometimes can be. And the next example where some nominalizations are good. Oh, actually, this isn't. No. There are examples, yes, where the passive is where nominalizations will come in. And that can be very good. The passive voice is useful. It's useful in the same way that this is useful, that the removal of waste from the body and correct. We don't really need to know who the actor is in this case. We don't need a subject that's a real person. What's important is the process. And the process can be kind of objectified into this thing. And it makes sense.
Is it sort of that in the previous example, how the verbs that you use in 1B are all sort of was, is, and they're actually much more clear and explicit action verbs almost in 1A?
Yes. You lose the dynamism here, and your verbs are, was the result of, and was based. Exactly. So you get verbs that are kind of empty. That aren't doing much work for you. And all these heavy nouns are doing all the work. So now when you get nouns that have a real meaning and that are really common in your field as nouns, as nominalizations, great, use those, because those are, everybody knows them. But just be careful if they're not useful or common in your field. Okay, so that was just a little tip about writing. When you are writing to yourself and asking questions, if you find yourself getting into a lot of nominalizations, just check yourself and say, how can I write this really straightforwardly? And then if you want to go back to the nominalizations in some cases, fine. But you're making a choice at least. You're not doing something just because it sort of vaguely feels more objective. All right, I really wanted to do this last part, but I actually decided, because I thought we would have tables, and I thought we would be writing, and I didn't think to ask about that, and I really wanted for you to do some writing here, but I think we've run out of time for that, right? Because wasn't I going till 1:30?
You can have a couple more minutes.
We could do 5 minutes, but I know it might not be comfortable for all of you here to actually be writing, but I wanted to have you, why don't we do that, if you have something that you can write on. This actually can seem silly, but it is so useful. And when I was in a grants workshop just a little bit ago, we wrote for 10 minutes. And I thought, that is exactly what I want to do in my writing workshop. And it was helpful for me. It's helpful for all of us. So try one of these starter phrases and just write for 5 minutes, and we'll be quiet. Some keywords related to my topic are, the gap I hope to fill is, a conclusion I might reach is, an example of support is. And let's just take 5 minutes and see what happens. If you just get a few sentences that capture what that gap is, you've made a huge stride, or brainstormed some other key topics that you're now going to go do some more searches on. Even that amount of little bit of time can really make a big difference. And I think that this cartoon kind of gets at that. He clicks, goes, yes! She says, finished another paragraph, did we? I'm a writing god! I think that's great. Because it's true, you are a writing god if you write a paragraph every day. No kidding. Even if you throw it out, it helped you. So I'll say thank you now, and write away. Start writing. Okay, thanks a lot. So I'll leave this.